In the mid-1st century AD, at the height of Rome's imperial power, a small band of Romans ventured farther into Africa than any of their known predecessors. Imagine a column of sunburnt legionaries and local guides trudging through the Sahara's endless sands, their armor shimmering under a relentless sun. They were led by a man named Septimius Flaccus, tasked with pursuing elusive raiders who had dared to harass Rome's African frontier. This expedition would carry them beyond the familiar fringes of the empire and into lands virtually unknown to Mediterranean peoples. What follows is the story of the remarkable trek that would later blur the lines between fact and legend. This is the first Roman expedition to Lake Chad in the heart of Africa. The geopolitical backdrop of Flaccus's mission was Rome's effort to secure its North African provinces and trade routes in the decades following Emperor Augustus. By the 1st century AD, Rome controlled the fertile Mediterranean coast of Africa, including cities like Leptis Magna and Sabratha in modern Libya. These coastal cities prospered on Saharan trade. Gold, exotic animals, and ivory came north in exchange for Roman goods. However, the riches of the interior were guarded by distance, heat, and the independent peoples of the desert. Chief among these were the Garamantes, a Berber kingdom centered on the Fezzan region of the Sahara. The Garamantes controlled oases and conducted their own agriculture and trade. They were no mere barbarian nomads, despite Roman stereotypes that painted them as bandits on chariots. In fact, the Garamantes built a capital city at Garama in modern Libya and engineered underground water channels to irrigate their lands. In essence, they had a hidden civilization thriving in the desert that could facilitate trade with the wider Roman world. Yet, from Rome's perspective, they were also troublesome neighbors. Trade caravans and Roman outposts in North Africa sometimes suffered raids from nomadic groups, likely operating in or beyond Garamantian territory. These raiders may have operated with the tacit approval of the Garamantes, though this, of course, is only an educated guess by modern historians. Such disturbances threatened the flow of goods and the peace along the empire's southern border. Emperor Augustus had earlier confronted this problem through a military campaign led by Lucius Cornelius Balbus in 19 BC. Balbus penetrated deep into the Sahara with 10,000 legionaries, defeated the Garamantes, and even earned a triumph in Rome for his victories. Roman accounts claim that Balbus's men pushed beyond the Garamantes' stronghold and glimpsed a great river deep in the interior. Indeed, Roman artifacts and coins have been found as far south as Mali, supporting the notion that some soldiers or traders reached those distant lands. Balbus's foray secured a temporary peace and expanded geographical knowledge of Africa. His campaign demonstrated that the Sahara was not an insurmountable barrier and whetted Roman appetites for the wealth lying beyond. In the decades after Balbus, other Romans took up similar paths. In 41 AD, the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus led an army across the Atlas Mountains of Mauritania, observing snow-capped peaks and reaching into lands south of modern Morocco. These ventures were rare and bold, fueled by a mix of strategic concern and curiosity. By 50 AD, Rome again needed to project power southward, this time in response to renewed incursions from the desert. This set the stage for Septimius Flaccus's legendary expedition to the shores of Lake Chad, where he would see wonders beyond comprehension. The expedition of Flaccus was prompted by a specific threat. A rebellious tribe from the interior had attacked the region around Leptis Magna. Leptis Magna was a flourishing Roman city on the coast, in what is now Libya, and such raids endangered its trade networks and prosperity. Roman authorities in Africa couldn't ignore these attacks. Thus, around 50 AD, Septimius Flaccus, an official whose background remains somewhat mysterious, was commissioned to lead a retaliatory strike deep into the Sahara. Little is recorded about Flaccus himself. He's not listed as a governor or a legion's commander in other records, which has led historians to speculate significantly about his identity. He may have been a Roman from the equestrian class, or provincial officer entrusted with a desert detachment. It's also possible that perhaps Ptolemy, our main source on this expedition, garbled his name in transmission. Regardless of his rank, Flaccus clearly possessed the skill and authority to command an arduous campaign. He gathered a contingent of soldiers, likely a mix of legionaries from the African garrison and local auxiliaries familiar with desert warfare, and prepared to march south from Leptis Magna. Equipping the force for a trans-Saharan journey required careful planning, and unfortunately we don't have the full details, but historians are able to offer educated guesses. The Romans would have secured camels to carry water and supplies, since these animals were essential for traversing vast waterless distances. The early part of the route was likely known from earlier incursions, and some of the later details may have been provided by North African traders. They would have traveled from the Mediterranean coast to the first string of oases and into the Garamantes domain. Messages may have been sent ahead to Garama, the Garamantian capital, warning its king not to obstruct Rome's punitive mission. Or perhaps no warning was given as Flaccus intended to surprise the raiders. Either way, the expedition's goal was twofold: punish the nomadic marauders and, by doing so, secure safer conditions for Roman trade. Any intelligence gathered about the lands beyond would be a welcome bonus for Rome's geographers and merchants. Flaccus led his men from the olive groves and marble villas of Leptis into the harsh Libyan interior, leaving behind the familiar world of Roman roads for uncharted wastes. Southward they trekked, likely passing settlements like Cidamus, modern Gadames, and then entering the Fezzan, the heartland of the Garamantes. Along the way, they would have seen the landscape change, coastal plains giving way to arid highlands, and then to the great sand seas of the Sahara. It was a realm of shimmering mirages by day and brilliant stars by night. The expedition probably followed caravan routes known to desert nomads, moving from one life-saving oasis to the next. Reaching Garamantian territory, Flaccus had to deal with the very people Rome once subdued under Balbus. According to the account preserved by the later geographer Ptolemy, Flaccus marched into Garamantes territory and subdued raiders. The exact details aren't known, but it would appear that the Garamantians themselves may not have agreed to this Roman incursion initially. Perhaps a set of skirmishes took place near the oasis towns in modern Libya, a clash of Roman discipline against swift desert fighters who knew the terrain. Flaccus's troops managed to defeat, or at least disperse the raiding tribes, and thus halted the attacks on Roman lands. In doing so, he likely struck a blow to the Garamantian king's authority, or negotiated an understanding to allow his further passage. Pressing onward, Flaccus didn't turn back after chastising the raiders. He was determined to push deeper, where few Romans had gone. The expedition continued south past the Garamantes' last outposts. They traversed the rugged Tibesti Mountains, today located in modern Chad, whose dark volcanic peaks rose unexpectedly from the desert's flat expanse. Crossing these mountains was no small feat, and the terrain is difficult, cut by canyons and prone to extreme temperatures. Yet beyond Tibesti, the Romans found an even greater surprise. After roughly 3 months of arduous travel across barren sands and stony plains, Flaccus arrived at a vast lake in the midst of the savannah. Ancient reports refer to it as the Lake of the Hippopotamus and Rhinoceros, a description that vividly captures the exotic fauna the Romans encountered there. In fact, this was very likely what we know today as Lake Chad, which was then a much larger lake than in modern times. The soldiers who had trudged through dune and dust now stood on the shores of a freshwater sea teeming with life. One can imagine their awe as they beheld animals only heard of in travelers' tales. They saw massive hippos wallowing in the shallows and on the reedy banks, and the unmistakable silhouette of a two-horned rhinoceros. Elephants might have roamed the vicinity as well, given the lake's extensive wetlands in that era. For Romans more accustomed to the tame olive groves of Italy or the dry hills of Tunisia, the sight of such creatures in their natural habitat must have been breathtaking. Flaccus and his men had effectively reached the edge of the world, as it was then known to Greco-Roman civilization. They had entered the land the Romans called Ethiopia, a broad term they used for sub-Saharan Africa and its peoples. Specifically, Ptolemy records that Flaccus journeyed into a region called Agesimba, which is described as far south of the Sahara. Agesimba's precise location is debated, but the ancient account places it near Lake Chad, implying that the Romans encountered indigenous communities there. Unfortunately, the details of any interaction between the native peoples of Lake Chad and the Roman expedition are lost to history. Ptolemy's summary gives no ethnographic descriptions, only noting that Flaccus's was the first Roman force to spend any length of time in that far southern region. It's possible the Romans made peaceful contact, trading trinkets for food and information. The lack of recorded conflict at the lake suggests that Flaccus didn't engage in major hostilities there. Instead, the expedition likely rested and refilled water skins, marveling at the fertile contrast to the desert behind them. They had achieved their outward objective. The nomadic raiders were vanquished or cowed, and an astonishing geographical discovery lay under their sandals. After reaching the Great Lake and planting the metaphorical eagle standard farther south than it had ever been, Flaccus had to bring his men safely home. The expedition retraced its path northward, crossing again the burning dunes and treacherous highlands. They would return with stories of a gigantic lake and its beasts, of strange lands rich with water and life beyond the desert. Back in Roman North Africa, the mission could be counted a success on absolutely all accounts. Flaccus had avenged the attacks on Leptis Magna and impressed upon the Garamantes the reach of Roman power. If any captives or spoils were taken, they might have been paraded in provincial towns. Unlike Balbus, however, Flaccus didn't receive a grand triumph in Rome, and indeed, his deeds are not celebrated in surviving Roman annals. This relative silence may be due to Flaccus's lower status, or simply the limited nature of the records that have survived. It's very possible there was a great work written about Flaccus's journey, but we simply don't have it, nor do we know about it. Nevertheless, his journey left a mark on imperial knowledge. Reports from the expedition likely filtered back to scholars and map makers. Within a few decades, Roman geographers had incorporated these new insights. Maps were adjusted to show a water body deep in Africa, and later writers like Ptolemy knew to call Lake Chad by its evocative nickname, the Lake of the Hippopotamus and Rhinoceros. There are strong indications that despite the lack of contemporary sources lauding him, Flaccus's exploits inspired further ventures through the Great Desert. Roman strategy in Africa often blended military aims with exploration. In 70 AD, just 20 years later, another commander, Gaius Valerius Festus, marched south with the 3rd Augustan Legion to deal with the Garamantes uprising once again. Festus is said to have followed the course of earlier explorers, pushing through the Sahara after subduing the tribes. Some accounts even credit one of these expeditions, variously attributed to Flaccus or Festus, with leaving a small garrison of Roman soldiers somewhere in the far interior. The idea that a Roman outpost might have briefly existed near the lands of Lake Chad is, of course, fascinating. However, as yet, there has been no archaeological findings to prove this one way or the other. The tale of Flaccus's march to Lake Chad straddles the line between established history and intriguing speculation. Our principal source, the 2nd century geographer Claudius Ptolemy, never witnessed these events himself. He compiled them from earlier reports, notably those of Marinus of Tyre a few decades after Flaccus. Ptolemy's Geographia distilled these travels into coordinates and brief notes, which means we are working with what amounts to a fragment of the original story. We're seeing a distillation of something that was already distilled, and which may have been further distilled from an unknown source used by Marinus. And note here that I say an unknown source used by Marinus. While Marinus is extremely influential, unfortunately none of his works survived, so we're denied the ability to cross-reference Flaccus's account with what Marinus wrote. Thus, one modern debate centers on credibility. Did Flaccus truly reach Lake Chad, or did Ptolemy or his source misinterpret the data? Many historians give credence to the journey, since the details align with geographic reality. The mention of a large lake with hippos and rhinos strongly suggests Lake Chad. No other known lake in that vicinity matches the description, and it would be an odd detail to invent. Furthermore, Ptolemy references major rivers in the area which correspond to the rivers which feed into Lake Chad. This precision suggests that Ptolemy was working off accurate sources from someone who was indeed familiar with the water systems of this large lake. While it's generally universally accepted that Flaccus did make the journey, the finer details have been questioned as well. In Flaccus's case, some have wondered whether he personally went all the way to Lake Chad, or if he sent a smaller party beyond the Tibesti Mountains, while he remained in the safer north. Because Ptolemy's account is terse, we can't be sure if Flaccus saw the lake himself or simply received reports from native guides. Roman coins dated to the 1st and 2nd centuries have been found in Chad, which is astounding at first glance. However, these findings are often isolated and could have arrived through peaceful trade or later era contacts, rather than a specific military expedition. Another point of debate involves the expedition's outcome and purpose. While clearly initiated as a punitive raid against rowdy nomads, Flaccus's journey took on exploratory dimensions, for reasons that aren't fully known. Did the Romans intend from the outset to reach Agasimba, or was that a spontaneous extension once the military objective was done? Others believe these could have perhaps been two expeditions, one to punish the raiders, and another separate one to follow up on intel learned during the initial police action in North Africa. If we are to believe the most grand version of the story, the Roman expedition to Lake Chad under Flaccus is one of the most compelling stories of ancient travel. Flaccus marched his men beyond the frontier of maps, crossed deadly deserts, and stood on the shores of Central Africa's Great Lake, all for the glory of Rome. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out my other channels, my podcast, and more by clicking the links in the description. In ancient China, political power was not just a matter of might or lineage, but a reflection of cosmic favor. Emperors rose and fell not by strength alone, but by the will of heaven. This belief was encapsulated in the mandate of heaven, a doctrine that became the cornerstone of Chinese political philosophy. According to this idea, there could only be one legitimate ruler of China at any given time, and that ruler held a sacred right to govern for as long as he retained heaven's approval. If an emperor governed justly, maintained order, and cared for the welfare of his people, heaven, known as Tian in Chinese, would bless his reign. But if a ruler became despotic or negligent, then heaven's mandate could be withdrawn as swiftly as it was granted. The concept of the mandate of heaven first emerged during the Zhou dynasty in the 11th century BC as a groundbreaking justification for dynastic change. It arose from a real political upheaval, the overthrow of the Shang dynasty by the Zhou clan. In 1046 BC, King Wu of Zhou led his forces to defeat King Dixin, the last Shang king, at the Battle of Mu. The Shang had ruled for centuries, claiming divine favor through their deity Shangdi, but by the end their court was infamous for excess and cruelty. According to Zhou accounts, King Dixin had become a tyrant, squandering state resources on debauchery and enforcing brutal punishments, while neglecting the kingdom's welfare. To a populace suffering under a corrupt ruler, the fall of the Shang seemed both inevitable and justified. Now, before I go on, I need to note that the Zhou ruled China in some capacity for about 800 years after this overthrow. That is to say, they had significant time to make sure that the official surviving historical narratives portrayed the Shang dynasty they overthrew as decadent or even degenerate in nature. Further, Confucius himself venerated the Duke of Zhou, the younger brother of King Wu, as a model sagely and political ideal for all individuals to aspire to. This endorsement by the most influential moral philosopher in Chinese history would of course pay dividends for the Zhou dynasty at the expense of the Shang's reputation. After their victory, the Zhou rulers needed to legitimize seizing power and being seen as something more than mere upstarts. To combat this, they introduced the idea of Tian, or heaven, as the supreme moral authority. Breaking from the Shang's worship of the celestial lord, the Zhou declared that heaven, a more abstract concept, had chosen them to rule in place of the fallen Shang. Thus was born the mandate of heaven. The claim that heaven had withdrawn its favor from the Shang due to their misrule and granted it to the virtuous Zhou. Zhou propagandists pointed to omens and disasters, strange celestial signs, floods, famines, interpreting these as signs of heaven's anger at the Shang. Natural calamities like earthquakes or famine were taken as divine messages about an emperor's virtue. Even rebellion against a reigning dynasty could now be justified as the righteous will of heaven. Importantly, the mandate of heaven had no fixed term and was not bound to any one royal lineage. Unlike some other cultures' ideas of eternal divine right, the Chinese mandate was conditional. It held that any person, from a noble to a commoner to a foreign horse lord, could receive heaven's blessing to become emperor, so long as he proved himself a just and able ruler. History was thus depicted as a moral continuum. Each dynasty rose with heaven's favor and fell when it lost virtue. This concept was the Zhou's most significant contribution to Chinese political thought, providing a powerful justification for regime change and setting clear moral expectations for rulers. At its heart, the mandate of heaven carried a profound message about merit and morality in governance. Heaven was conceived not as a personal God who arbitrarily backed kings, but as the embodiment of an impartial moral order. The emperor, honored as the Son of Heaven, was believed to rule Tianxia, all under heaven, on heaven's behalf. This meant that a ruler's legitimacy depended on his virtue and ability to maintain harmony in the realm. Good governance, characterized by justice, prosperity, and stability, was seen as evidence that an emperor truly held heaven's mandate. Conversely, signs of governmental failure or moral decay suggested that the cosmic balance had turned against the ruler. Chinese historians made this principle explicit in their records. They noted that when dynasties were about to fall, unusual natural disasters and omens often struck, clear signs that heaven was displeased with the reigning king. Thus, droughts or floods weren't random misfortunes, but heavenly warning shots. If the emperor ignored such warnings and the kingdom slipped further into disorder, it was expected that heaven would revoke its mandate and allow someone else to take charge. This philosophy had a dual effect. It reinforced imperial authority while also limiting it. On one hand, the doctrine reassured people that the sitting emperor was the rightful, divinely endorsed ruler, and he was on the throne only because heaven willed it so. On the other hand, it implicitly granted the populace and ambitious would-be leaders the right to depose a wicked or inept ruler. The mandate of heaven thus included a de facto right of rebellion, which, given the historical context of the shift from the Shang to the Zhou, this makes sense. If a dynasty fell, that very fact was interpreted as proof that it deserved to fall. The Confucian philosopher Mencius articulated this idea. The people's welfare is paramount, and a ruler who causes suffering loses heaven's sanction. In his view, overthrowing such a tyrant wasn't treason, but a righteous duty. Put another way, a successful rebellion was itself proof that heaven had sided with the uprising, since only with heaven's favor could the revolutionaries triumph in the end. This notion served as a profound check on absolutism. It established an ancient moral contract between the ruler and the ruled that tethered political power to ethical behavior, at least theoretically. Once established, the mandate of heaven became the lens through which the Chinese interpreted their history. Dynasties, they believed, rose and fell in an ongoing dynastic cycle guided by heaven's mandate. A new dynasty typically began with vigor and virtue, bringing peace and prosperity. Over time, complacency or corruption might set in. The taxes would rise too high, officials would grow decadent, and the court would become mired in some combination of extreme detached luxury and petty infighting. Eventually, disasters and unrest would spread, signaling that the dynasty had lost heaven's favor. Finally, a challenger would emerge, perhaps a disaffected general or a peasant leader, to overthrow the discredited regime and found a new dynasty, claiming heaven's blessing anew. This cycle repeated across the centuries, and the Chinese people came to view it as the natural order of things. History provides vivid examples of this pattern. After the long reign of the Zhou kings, China descended into the Warring States period from 475 to 221 BC as rival lords fought for supremacy. Out of this chaos, the state of Qin triumphed and unified China in 221 BC, ending centuries of division. King Zheng of Qin crowned himself the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, but the Qin dynasty's rule, though powerful, proved brutally harsh. Forced labor for grand projects and the emperor's extremely draconian laws bred widespread resentment. After all, the idea of taking valuable craftsmen away from their jobs to build a giant mausoleum filled with terracotta warriors may not be seen as the most prudent usage of resources. This is what we call speedrunning the loss of the mandate of heaven. The Qin's unyielding approach quickly backfired. After the first emperor died, rebellion erupted throughout the land. Everyone from oppressed peasants to disgruntled nobles rose up against the Qin, with all parties citing the dynasty's cruelty and misrule as evidence that it lacked heaven's favor. This is evidence that the mandate of heaven wasn't simply a philosophical idea that people spoke about. They actually acted on it as a rallying cry. Within a few years, the Qin government had crumbled. By 202 BC, Liu Bang, a former peasant-turned-general, defeated his rivals and founded the Han dynasty, declaring that heaven's mandate had passed to him and his heirs. Liu Bang's humble origins reinforce the notion that merit and virtue, not noble birth, were the true qualifications for rulership under heaven. The Han Dynasty, from 206 BC to 220 AD, went on to preside over one of China's golden ages, and it fully embraced the mandate of heaven. Han emperors performed elaborate rituals to honor heaven and earth, and in times of natural disaster or social unrest, they took such events as prompts to correct their policies. Yet, as anyone who has ever played a Dynasty Warriors game knows, the Han too eventually succumbed to the dynastic cycle, with the Jin Empire eventually coming out triumphant. So it went, dynasty after dynasty. The Tang Dynasty, running from 618 to 907 for example, was founded after the collapse of the short-lived Sui, which had overextended itself with costly conflicts and public works. When famine and rebellion ended the Sui, the victorious Tang rulers claimed the mandate and ushered in an era of prosperity often called a Golden Age. Likewise, in the 14th century, the Mongol-born Yuan dynasty was racked by floods, plagues, and peasant rebellions. These were calamities taken as signs that the Mongols had lost heaven's favor. Seizing the moment, a rebel leader named Zhu Yuanzhang led the uprising that toppled the Mongol rulers. In 1368, he declared himself emperor and founded the Ming dynasty, proclaiming that heaven had turned back to native Chinese rule. He proclaimed that the Mongols' misrule had cost them heaven's mandate. Even dynasties founded by outsiders continued to invoke the mandate. The Qing dynasty, from 1644 to 1912, was established by Manchu conquerors from the frigid northeast. The Qing rulers claimed that it was peasant rebels, notably Li Zicheng, who brought down the Ming dynasty, not the Manchus themselves. By defeating those rebels and reuniting the country, the Manchus argued, they had earned heaven's mandate by rescuing China from chaos. Like their predecessors, Qing emperors also regarded natural disasters during their reign as warnings from heaven to reflect on their governance and make amends. Nevertheless, by the 19th century, the Qing regime was plagued by corruption, foreign pressures, and massive uprisings. These were troubles many saw as proof that the dynasty had lost its virtue, and with it, the mandate of heaven. Ultimately, the Qing fell in the early 20th century amid revolution, and with its fall, the Chinese imperial era came to an end. For over 2 millennia, the mandate of heaven was the bedrock of Chinese political culture and the lens through which history was understood. It instilled the idea that legitimacy came from ethical governance and that no dynasty was irreplaceable. Each new dynasty portrayed the previous ruler's downfall as a moral failure and its own rise as the restoration of righteous order. Unlike the European notion of the divine right of kings, which granted kings unconditional sanction by God, the mandate of heaven set a high bar. A Chinese emperor's right to rule was conditional upon just governance and could be revoked if he became a tyrant. This principle lent Chinese history a cyclical rhythm, and even the mightiest dynasty could fall if it grew decadent, and even a peasant could rise as emperor if he earned heaven's favor. But this begs the question, was this well-meaning principle actually a recipe for instability? This topic remains hotly contested among scholars until this day, with no clear consensus emerging as yet.